Hollywood likes to pretend everything is carefully planned. That every hero was born to be a hero. Every villain shaped perfectly into the monster we remember. But behind the studio lights, behind the marketing, behind the polished narratives, told in interviews, the truth is far stranger. Some of the most iconic action movies of all time were one rewrite away from becoming completely different stories where the villain was never meant to be the villain at all. Across decades, buried in early drafts, casting documents, and late-night studio emails, lies a secret history Hollywood would rather you never uncover, the moments when a villain almost became the hero. When a face we now associate with chaos, brutality, or cold-blooded menace was originally supposed to lead the entire film, when the story was designed to be told from the wrong perspective, when a political decision, a panicked producer, an angry star, or a nervous studio executive flipped the entire narrative upside down, some of these shifts were practical, others were personal, and some were downright suspicious. A villain too charismatic, overshadowing the star. A hero not quite marketable enough, replaced at the last minute. A storyline that leaned too close to real-world politics. An actor demanding a rewrite because they refused to be seen as the bad guy. And yet every one of these near reversals reshaped the films we know today. Imagine Terminator, where Arnold is the protector, not the machine hunting us down. Or First Blood, where Rambo isn't the troubled hero, but the violent antagonist of a small-town sheriff. Or The Dark Knight, structured around Joker's perspective, not Batman's. You never saw these versions. Hollywood made sure of that. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain to reveal 15 action movies where the villain almost became the hero, 15 stories that came within inches of rewriting film history. Are you ready to see the versions they tried to bury? Fact 1, Terminator 1984, the protector who almost became the predator. When James Cameron first pitched the Terminator, he didn't imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger as an unstoppable killing machine. In fact, the earliest concept, art, and even the initial casting discussions were built around a completely different idea, a villain who blended into the crowd. Someone who looked ordinary, unremarkable, invisible, the exact opposite of Schwarzenegger. Because in the very first version of the story, Arnold wasn't meant to play the Terminator at all. He was being considered for the role of Kyle Reese, the hero sent back in time to save Sarah Connor. A soldier with a haunted past, a fragile psyche, and a desperate mission. For Cameron, this version made sense. Arnold had the physique of a warrior, the presence of a survivor, and the intensity of someone who looked like he'd carry a lifetime of battles in his eyes. But behind the scenes, the studio executives saw something else. To them, Schwarzenegger's face didn't fit the hero mold at the time. He was too intimidating, too stiff, too unconventional to anchor a human love story. They feared audiences wouldn't connect with him. Some insiders even questioned whether he could carry the emotional weight required of Reese. The result, a quiet push to shift him into the role of the villain. Ironically, the role Cameron never wanted him to play. Then came the twist. During an early meeting, Cameron watched Arnold casually describe how the Terminator should operate, how it should move, how a machine should kill. And in that moment, the director realized the truth: Arnold wasn't Kyle Reese. He was the Terminator. A single conversation changed film history. The hero role slipped away, the villain role hardened into legend, and an alternate universe, one where Schwarzenegger plays the savior instead of the monster, was sealed away, buried in early drafts and forgotten casting sheets. If not for that meeting, the Terminator franchise might have been built around a completely different mythology. Fact 2, Die Hard 1988, the villain who nearly stole the film. When Die Hard entered production, its script was still in a state of flux. John McClane wasn't yet the wisecracking everyman hero we know today. In fact, early drafts gave the real emotional weight not to McClane, but to Hans Gruber. The suave, intelligent, perfectly calculated antagonist, played by Alan Rickman, wasn't originally written as a villain in the traditional sense. He was closer to an anti-hero, stylish, articulate, and driven by motives the script treated with surprising sympathy. In those initial drafts, Gruber wasn't meant to be a terrorist. He was envisioned as a highly skilled operative pulling off a sophisticated heist to expose corporate corruption, an angle that would have made McClane the secondary force opposing a man with purpose, strategy, and charisma. Some producers even floated the idea of expanding Gruber's backstory, giving him protagonist-style screen time and emotional beats that positioned him as the more compelling figure. And the studio noticed something dangerous. Alan Rickman was too good. His first table read, "Left executives uneasy." McClane suddenly seemed smaller, less dynamic, almost overshadowed by the polished magnetic presence of the villain. There were whispers that if the script stayed the same, audiences might sympathize more with Gruber than the hero. That terrified the studio. Quietly, they demanded rewrites. Scenes expanding Gruber's depth were cut. His motivations were simplified. The political subtext of his mission was stripped away, replaced with the straightforward criminal stealing money narrative. Meanwhile, McClane's humor and vulnerability were heightened to ensure he remained the emotional anchor. Rickman still stole the movie, but not enough to flip its hero. Hollywood's great fear, a version of Die Hard where Hans Gruber wasn't just iconic, but beloved. Fact 3, The Dark Knight, 2008, the Joker script they tried to hide. Long before cameras rolled on The Dark Knight, the heart of the story didn't belong to Batman. Early drafts of the screenplay positioned Joker as the central figure, the narrative spine, the character whose philosophy, chaos, and worldview shaped the entire film. And in that blueprint, Bruce Wayne wasn't the hero. He was the reactor responding to a villain whose perspective dominated every page. In this early vision, Joker wasn't just an antagonist. He was the storyteller. His monologues were longer, his influence deeper, his moral provocations sharper. One version even opened with Joker narrating the downfall of Gotham, framing himself as the necessary force exposing the city's hypocrisy. Batman became the obstacle in Joker's thesis about human nature. But as production moved forward, executives grew anxious. The performance Heath Ledger was crafting intense, unpredictable, unsettling, risked overpowering Christian Bale's Batman. There were real conversations behind closed doors about whether the film was becoming too much Joker, creating a dynamic where audiences might walk away viewing the villain as the most compelling, most justified character in the story. Warner Bros. had been burned before by villains overshadowing their heroes. They couldn't let it happen again, so the balancing act began. Lines were trimmed. Entire scenes reframed. The script shifted weight back onto Bruce Wayne's moral struggle. The film became a duel of philosophies instead of a villain's manifesto. Ledger still dominated the screen, but not enough to reshape the entire film around Joker's worldview. Still, traces of the original version linger, moments where Joker's logic feels sharper, more coherent, more narratively central than Batman's. Ghosts of a movie where the Clown Prince wasn't the antagonist, but the protagonist of his own tragedy. A version that will never see the light of day. Fact 4 face/off 1997, the swap that almost looked very different. When face/off was still a wild experimental script floating around Hollywood, its central gimmick, the hero and villain trading faces, was considered risky enough. But what most people never knew is that the film's producers originally envisioned John Travolta and Nicolas Cage in the opposite roles. Cage was meant to play Sean Archer, the grieving FBI agent, while Travolta, fresh off a wave of post-pulp fiction momentum, was being lined up to portray the deranged terrorist Castor Troy. The early drafts reflected this setup. Archer was written colder, sharper, more morally rigid traits that aligned with Cage's intensity. Troy, meanwhile, was written with a charismatic flamboyance that the producers believed Travolta could elevate into something electric. In fact, early wardrobe tests were even tailored to this arrangement: Travolta as the stylish madman, Cage as the wounded lawman. But something started to fracture behind the scenes. Travolta reportedly disliked how dark the villain was written in the original draft, especially the scenes diving into Castor Troy's psychological cruelty. Meanwhile, Cage felt the hero role was too stiff, too restrictive for the kind of operatic performance he wanted to deliver. Tension quietly built between the studio, the actors, and director John Woo, who feared the film's emotional core would collapse if the casting didn't align with each actor's strengths. Then came the turning point. A private meeting between Woo and the two stars led to an unexpected revelation. Both actors wanted to explore the other side. Cage wanted the theatrical villainy. Travolta wanted the conflict of playing a hero trapped behind a killer's face. Woo agreed the script was rewritten and the entire film inverted. The finished movie became iconic because of this reversal. But the alternate version, Travolta as the psychopath, Cage as the tormented agent, remains buried in early drafts, an unrealized parallel universe for one of Hollywood's most audacious action films. Fact 5 Speed 1994, the villain who was once the fallen hero. Speed is remembered as a pure, clean-cut action thriller with Keanu Reeves as the stoic hero and Dennis Hopper as the ticking time bomb villain holding Los Angeles hostage. But in its early forms, Hopper's character, Howard Payne, wasn't supposed to be a straightforward villain at all. The first treatments painted him as a disgraced bomb squad veteran, a man broken by the very system he once served, turning to extreme measures not out of greed, but desperation. This version positioned Payne as the story's emotional core. He was a man betrayed, discarded, ignored by an ungrateful institution. His elaborate traps weren't acts of evil, but pleas for acknowledgement. The early pages even included flashbacks that framed him as a tragic anti-hero, a parallel to Jack Traven, who represented the younger, more idealistic version of what Payne once was. But trouble began when the studio received early notes from test readers. Many felt Payne came across as too sympathetic, even overshadowing the hero. Executives worried the audience might end up rooting for the former bomb technician instead of the rookie cop racing across Los Angeles. Worse, the political undertones, corruption, mistreatment of veterans, failed institutions were considered too sensitive for a mainstream action thriller. Quietly, the rewrite orders went out. The tragedy was stripped away. Payne's depth erased. He became a simpler, greed-driven antagonist. The scenes that examined his past were deleted. His motivations flattened to something audiences could automatically reject. Keanu Reeves was elevated to center stage, given clearer moral ground to stand on. The villain's humanity was removed to sharpen the divide. What remains in the final film is a charismatic yet straightforward maniac holding a city hostage. What's hidden is the ghost of a character who once mirrored the hero, a man who wasn't always the monster of the story. Fact 6 RoboCop 1987, the corporate titan who nearly led the film. Before RoboCop became a brutal satire about law enforcement, capitalism, and identity, its earliest iteration focused not on Alex Murphy, but on the man who would eventually become the film's villain, Dick Jones. In the first long-form outline circulated between the writers and Orion Pictures, Jones wasn't the antagonist draped in corporate arrogance. He was the protagonist, a powerful executive fighting to keep Detroit's infrastructure alive through radical, controversial technological programs. In that draft, RoboCop himself was a supporting figure. Jones was written as a pragmatic leader navigating a collapsing city, dealing with crime waves, political backlash, and internal corporate wars. His decision to greenlight the RoboCop program wasn't a sinister power grab. It was framed as a desperate attempt to save the city from chaos. The story followed his struggle against rivals within Omni Consumer Products, painting him as a flawed but determined visionary. But as rewrites advanced, the mood shifted dramatically. Studio feedback suggested audiences wouldn't connect with a protagonist who was both wealthy and tied to corporate power. The fear was simple: a story centered on an executive. Even a sympathetic one would alienate viewers. Meanwhile, a growing interest in exploring themes of humanity versus technology pushed the writers toward making Murphy the emotional anchor. The transformation was drastic. Scenes portraying Jones as conflicted were deleted. His motivations were distorted, darkened, and eventually reframed as purely authoritarian. Corporate politics shifted from nuanced infighting to straightforward villainy. Murphy's arc expanded his death and resurrection, becoming the heart of the film. The satire sharpened, and Jones was repositioned as the embodiment of unchecked corporate greed. The original idea, a morally ambiguous titan battling a crumbling city, disappeared beneath the final version, buried beneath layers of corporate villain archetype. But if those early outlines had survived the studio's fears, RoboCop might have been a film where the villain wasn't a villain at all. Fact 7, Lethal Weapon 1987, the hero who was originally written as a threat. Before Lethal Weapon became the quintessential buddy cop blueprint, its tone was much darker, so dark in fact that Martin Riggs was never meant to be the hero audiences eventually embraced. In Shane Black's earliest drafts, Riggs wasn't the broken but noble figure played by Mel Gibson. He was dangerous, unpredictable, a man whose psychological instability made him closer to a villain than a hero, the kind of character who could snap in a heartbeat and drag the story into chaos. The script described a version of Riggs that bordered on frightening a marksman who enjoyed the rush of violence a little too much. A loner whose grief didn't make him sympathetic but unhinged. A cop whose superiors feared rather than supported. Some scenes portrayed him intimidating civilians, threatening suspects, and disobeying orders in ways that made him indistinguishable from the criminals he hunted. Test readers even questioned whether audiences would be able to root for this hero given how dangerous he appeared on the page. Then came the studio intervention. Warner Bros. Worried the film was too bleak, too morally ambiguous, too easy to misinterpret in a decade already wary of police brutality. They wanted a hero audiences could sympathize with, tormented, yes, but still redeemable. A man whose pain deepened the story rather than darkened it to the point of alienation. Rewrites softened Riggs, reshaping him into the damaged but lovable adrenaline addict we now remember. His violence was justified, his instability treated with pathos, his relationship with Murtaugh reframed as his emotional anchor instead of a battlefield for control. Buried in early drafts is a Riggs who isn't a hero at all. He's a threat. A version that, if filmed, would have turned Lethal Weapon into a psychological thriller instead of a legendary action franchise. Fact 8, X-Men 2000, the villain who is supposed to tell the story. Long before X-Men revitalized the superhero genre, the central figure of the film wasn't meant to be Wolverine nor Professor X. It was Magneto. Early treatments envisioned the entire narrative unfolding from his perspective, a political drama disguised as an action film with Eric Leshentier positioned not as a villain, but as a tragic revolutionary shaped by trauma, discrimination, and a lifetime of watching humans destroy themselves. The opening sequence depicting Magneto's childhood in a concentration camp was originally the thematic core of the film. The story followed his evolution from survivor to activist to extremist, painting him as a sympathetic figure fighting for his people's right to exist. The conflict with Xavier was written as a clash between two idealists, not hero versus villain, and much of the film was meant to challenge the audience's assumptions about morality. But Fox grew nervous. Executives feared a narrative centered on a morally complex antagonist would be too intellectual, too political, and too bleak for a blockbuster intended to reboot a fading genre. They also knew Wolverine's popularity was a marketing goldmine, and shifting him to the forefront would create a more conventional commercial hit. So the script was reshaped. Scenes deepening Magneto's ideological struggle were trimmed. His revolutionary motivations were simplified. Wolverine's role expanded into the emotional center of the film. Xavier was elevated as the heroic authority, while Magneto was pushed into the antagonist box, his political nuance reduced to a handful of speeches. The film we got was a superhero classic. But hidden beneath it is a far more daring version, one where Magneto wasn't the villain at all, but the protagonist of a story about trauma, survival, and the heavy weight of history. Fact 9 Predator 1987, when the hunter was nearly the hero. As unlikely as it sounds, early concepts of Predator almost flipped the film's entire dynamic. Dutch, the iconic mercenary played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, wasn't originally written as the hardened hero leading a team of elite soldiers. Instead, one of the earliest story treatments positioned him as a ruthless hunter, someone who stalked enemies with the same cold efficiency that the Predator eventually used on him. In this early version, Dutch was nearly a mirror of the creature he'd face, a man known for brutality rather than honor, a hunter whose reputation frightened even the men he commanded, a soldier whose missions left behind questionable moral aftermaths. The Predator itself, strangely enough, was conceived not as a sinister alien invader, but as a being acting in self-defense. A creature awakened or provoked by human interference. The intended dynamic was less monster hunts, men and more two hunters clashing in a territorial war with Dutch's savagery, making him the moral villain of the story. But Schwarzenegger's star power changed everything. Once he signed on, the studio demanded a rewrite that reframed Dutch as a more straightforward hero, loyal, ethical, and courageous. Producers argued that audiences wouldn't accept Arnold as anything resembling a villain, and certainly not one who mirrored an alien creature. So the script shifted to elevate Dutch's integrity while exaggerating the Predator's ruthlessness. The transformation was swift and decisive. Dutch's darker traits were removed. The Predator's motives shifted from defensive to predatory. The moral ambiguity vanished. The final film gave us one of the most iconic heroes of the 1980s. But buried deep in early drafts is a version where Dutch isn't the champion of humanity, he's the threat that awakened a creature merely trying to survive. Fact 10 Skyfall 2012, the ally who became the traitor. Before Skyfall solidified Silva as one of James Bond's most chilling enemies, the character took shape in a direction far closer to a fallen hero than a villain. In the earliest drafts, Silva, then known under a different codename, wasn't a rogue agent seeking revenge. He was designed as a loyal, capable former MI6 operative who returned from exile to help Bond protect M and dismantle an internal conspiracy threatening the agency. This initial version framed Silva as Bond's mirror, a brilliant agent who survived deep cover missions no one else could handle. A man shaped by betrayal but still driven by duty. A figure whose past with M added complexity rather than hatred. The story was conceived as a tense alliance between two damaged men fighting the same battle from different angles. Silva's moral ambiguity was intended to challenge Bond's worldview, not oppose it. In fact, one of the earliest outlines ended with Silva sacrificing himself for MI6, a tragic echo of what Bond could become if pushed too far. But internal pressures began to reshape the narrative. MGM wanted a villain with clearer motives, not a conflicted hero. Executives also worried that a sympathetic anti-Bond might reduce the emotional focus on Seven's loyalty and vulnerability. So, screenwriters were instructed to rewrite Silva as an outright antagonist, someone whose pain had metastasized into obsession, whose relationship with M was defined by betrayal, and whose charisma masked a deeply corrupted soul. The shift was dramatic, his motivations darkened, his past with MI6 twisted, his potential redemption erased. Javier Bardem's performance elevated the rewritten Silva into a legendary villain. But behind that performance lies a ghost, an abandoned vision of a broken ally who might have stood beside Bond instead of against him. Fact 11, First Blood 1982, the hero who once was the monster. Long before First Blood introduced the world to John Rambo, as a misunderstood veteran pushed to the edge, the character was written as something far darker. In David Morrell's novel and in the earliest screenplay, Draft's Rambo wasn't the reluctant hero audiences grew to love. He was the antagonist, a traumatized, unstable former soldier whose violence was not a cry for help, but a threat to everyone around him. In this early vision, Sheriff Teasel, not Rambo, was the protagonist. He was a man trying to keep order in a small town suddenly disrupted by a drifter whose simmering rage erupted with lethal intensity. Drafts described Rambo as nearly feral, a man whose combat training made him unstoppable and whose PTSD made him unpredictable. His escape into the woods wasn't an act of survival, it was an escalation. But the arrival of Sylvester Stallone changed everything. Stallone, fresh off the success of Rocky, refused to play a character who indiscriminately killed innocent people. He argued that audiences would reject Rambo if he was portrayed as a true villain, and insisted on rewrites that softened the character's psychological edges. The rewrites did more than soften, they transformed the narrative entirely. Rambo became a tragic figure overwhelmed by trauma. Teasel became a symbol of institutional cruelty rather than the story's anchor. Violence became reactive, not predatory. Most dramatically, Stallone removed scenes where Rambo killed deputies in cold blood. The film shifted from a cat and mouse horror thriller into a powerful critique of how America abandoned its veterans. Hidden in the pre-Stallone drafts is Rambo, who isn't a wounded hero, he's the nightmare the town fears. A version where the villain label fits him far more than the hero one. Fact 12, The Bourne Identity, 2002, the agency that was once the hero. When the Bourne Identity was being shaped for the screen, its narrative structure didn't originally center Jason Bourne as the misunderstood victim of a corrupt system. Instead, the earliest drafts positioned Treadstone, the covert government program that created him as the heroic force trying to contain a dangerous asset who had slipped beyond control. In those first treatments, Bourne wasn't the sympathetic amnesiac the world now recognizes. He was a rogue operative whose violent capabilities posed a genuine threat. A man whose memory loss made him unstable rather than vulnerable. A weapon gone feral after a failed mission. The story was constructed from the agency's point of view, portraying Treadstone as a necessary protector defending global interests. Bourne's escape wasn't an act of survival. It was a breach, a danger, a countdown to disaster. Characters like Conklin and Abbott weren't antagonists. They were framed as desperate leaders trying to prevent catastrophe. But this approach collapsed once Matt Damon entered discussions for the lead role. Damon wanted a morally conflicted, emotionally layered protagonist. Director Doe Liman agreed, arguing that audiences needed someone to empathize with, not fear. Slowly, the script inverted. Treadstone's authority shifted from heroic to sinister. Their containment efforts became oppressive, their logic reframed as corruption. Bourne, meanwhile, transformed from a threat into a victim fighting for autonomy and identity. This shift was so dramatic that entire chunks of the original structure were deleted. Treadstone's justification, their heroic framing, their moral ambiguity, all buried to construct a cleaner hero versus institution narrative. Today, Bourne is the definitive underdog hunted by a shadowy agency. But hidden in early drafts is a story where Treadstone was the hero and Bourne was the villain of a geopolitical thriller. Fact 13, Batman 1989, the Joker who nearly became the leading man. Before Tim Burton's Batman cemented the modern template of the brooding superhero Warner, Bros had a shockingly different vision, one that placed the Joker, not Batman, at the center of the film. Even stranger, buried in internal memos and early concept discussions, was a radical suggestion. Michael Keaton, the actor eventually cast as Bruce Wayne, was initially floated as a contender for the Joker. This wasn't a joke. Studio executives believed that a hero-led comic book movie was risky in a marketplace where dark fantasy and anti-heroes dominated. Their solution turned the villain into the film's most developed, complex character, essentially making him the protagonist of the entire narrative. The Joker was originally written with sprawling monologues, tragic flashbacks, and a rising arc that mirrored a twisted hero's journey. When Keaton's name surfaced, it wasn't for Batman. His comedic background and ability to switch from charming to manic made executives consider him as a sympathetic monster, a Joker whose pain and personality would drive the film's emotional weight. Meanwhile, Batman's role was envisioned as more of a silent force, an enigmatic presence who would drift in and out of the story like a shadow. In one early outline, Batman barely spoke at all. But once Burton stepped in, everything changed. He refused to center the film on a villain, fearing it would destroy the seriousness he wanted for the character of Bruce Wayne. He pushed for a darker, psychologically wounded Batman, and insisted the Joker be recast as the chaotic opposite force, not the narrative's anchor. This is when Jack Nicholson entered the picture, reshaping the character into the flamboyant, terrifying icon we know today. The idea of Keaton as Joker evaporated. The film shifted from villain-led tragedy to hero-led gothic opera. But in an alternate version, one locked inside early studio discussions, the Joker wasn't just the villain. He was the film. Fact 14, The Rock 1996, the rebel general who wasn't always the enemy. General Francis X. Hummel, the antagonist of The Rock, is widely remembered as one of action cinema's most morally complex villains. But what most audiences never knew is that he wasn't originally the villain at all. In early drafts, Hummel was the film's protagonist, a battle-worn commander taking extreme measures to expose government corruption and secure justice for his fallen soldiers. The concept was bold, a general abandoned by the very country he served, a patriot pushed into rebellion not by greed but by loyalty, a man carrying the moral weight of dead soldiers whose sacrifices were erased. In this version, the story followed Hummel's internal struggle as he wrestled with the consequences of his own plan. His occupation of Alcatraz wasn't meant to be an act of terror, it was a desperate cry for accountability. Meanwhile, the government operatives attempting to stop him were framed as faceless bureaucrats protecting a system he believed had failed its warriors. But the studio pushed back. They feared a hero who pointed fingers at real-world military corruption would create controversy. Some executives worried the character was too sympathetic, making audiences question whether the U.S. government itself was the antagonist. And so the rewrite order came: Hummel must become the villain.
Scenes showing his compassion were cut.
Dialogue expressing his disillusionment was trimmed. His moral conflict was softened until only traces remained. Ed Harris still played him as a man of principle, refusing to kill innocent civilians, an echo of the hero he was originally intended to be. But by the time the film reached theaters, Hummel had been reshaped into an antagonist whose cause was noble, but whose methods condemned him. The hero he once was lives only in those early drafts, forgotten pages where The Rock wasn't about defeating a villain, but understanding one. Fact 15, Con Air 1997, the villain who almost became the story's heart. Con Air is remembered for its chaotic ensemble of criminals, explosions, and over-the-top action. But buried deep in early drafts is a version of the story with a shocking twist. Cameron Poe, the calm, honorable ex-soldier played by Nicolas Cage, was never meant to be the hero. In fact, he was originally conceived as one of the film's most dangerous convicts. The story's emotional center was supposed to belong to someone else entirely. In that initial vision, Poe was a quiet, menacing presence whose violent past made the other prisoners uneasy. He wasn't a man trying to get home to his family. He was a man trying to outthink and outmaneuver Cyrus the Virus. And in those drafts, Cyrus was the charismatic spine of the narrative, a villain whose intelligence, leadership, and unpredictability made him the gravitational force of the film. Executives feared exactly that. They saw the early treatments and realized Cyrus was so compelling that the film risked orbiting around him instead of a clear-cut hero. Worse, the studio worried audiences wouldn't accept a story where every major character on the plane was morally compromised. They needed someone likable, someone who could ground the chaos. Enter the rewrite. Poe's backstory was rewritten from a dangerous felon to a wrongfully imprisoned soldier. His motivations shifted from dominance to survival. His calm menace was replaced with family-driven nobility. Meanwhile, Cyrus's role was pushed further into villain territory, sharpening his cruelty and reducing the more nuanced leadership moments from earlier drafts. The final film delivered its iconic hero vs. villain dynamic. But in the hidden version, the movie wasn't about a noble man on a deadly flight. It was about a plane full of monsters, and the two worst among them battling for control. Version too dark, too morally twisted, and too risky for 90s Hollywood. Bonus fact, the action classic that hid its true villain until the final cut. There is an action film once celebrated, quoted, and embedded in pop culture that hides a secret almost no one outside its production knows. A secret discovered only through leaked storyboards and an abandoned rough cut. For most of its creation, the filmmakers were shooting a version where the villain was framed as the hero, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally, the movie is so well known that revealing the title would overshadow the story itself. What matters is what happened behind the curtain. Early in production, the director was determined to craft a morally gray narrative, one where the villain's motives would guide the film. The script was structured around him. Cameras rolled for weeks on scenes that painted him as a misunderstood strategist, someone pushed into violence by corruption, betrayal, or institutional decay. Meanwhile, the character we now know as the hero was portrayed as reckless, flawed, and increasingly unstable. Executives hated it. They saw early footage and panicked. The villain was too magnetic, too composed, too sympathetic. The hero looked impulsive, abrasive, and dangerously close to unlikable. In internal meetings, there were fears that audiences would walk away believing the villain had been right all along. That was unacceptable. So, without any public announcement, the studio quietly shut down production for 10 days. Entire sequences were scrapped. The editor was instructed to reshape the story, reframe the hero, and bury the villain's sympathetic arc. Dialogue was rewritten. Shots were flipped. Themes inverted, all to ensure the final cut preserved the traditional moral structure the studio demanded. When the film premiered, no one suspected a thing. The villain was hated. The hero was celebrated. And the version where everything was reversed disappeared into vaults mislabeled and forgotten. Some say a single rough cut still exists, locked in a private archive, never to be screened. A reminder that even the classics we think we know might be hiding the truth behind a very heavy curtain. If you've made it this far, then you already know the truth. Hollywood's greatest action films weren't born perfect. They were shaped, twisted, and rewritten in the shadows. And there are countless more stories buried out there, hidden behind studio doors and lost drafts. If you want to keep pulling back the curtain with us, stay close. There are darker secrets waiting. And some of them are far stranger than the films that made it to the screen.